7 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. About 4,000 men were present, and having sent them away, he got into the boat with his disciples and went to the region of Dalmanutha. The Pharisees came and began to question Jesus. To test him, they asked him for a sign from heaven. He sighed deeply and said, "Why does this generation ask for a miraculous sign? I tell you the truth, no sign will be given to it." Then he left them, got back into the boat, and crossed to the other side. How many of you are having deja vu? This is very similar to a story we just read a couple weeks ago. But there's a couple important things to understand. In the Jewish mind, Numbers had a poetic nature that in English, we don't have anything like it. We're very mathematical, we're very scientific, and I like that. I love being alive in a scientific era. But one of the things that has been lost is that numbers in the ancient world often had a storytelling capacity that we just have sort of lost. And you may not like when I do this at all. Some people think that this is numerology. It's not numerology. Like numerology is like if I see a 9 and I go, oh, that means I'm gonna have a good day. That's numerology. That's not what I'm doing. I'm talking about poetic storytelling that involves numbers. So I just want you to know that 7 and 12 are related to each other. 12 is 3 times 4. 7 is 3 plus 4. Both of those are very important. If you have ever read the Jewish Bible, what we call the Old Testament, if you've ever read it, the number 7 and the number 12 pop up all of the time. And one of the explanations of that I like the most is when 3 and 4, this is that poetic way of telling a story, when 3 and 4 are in alignment, when they're in harmony, that means that heaven and earth are cooperating. And that's how you either have a 7 or a 12. And it's why it shows up in so many of the Jewish stories. So Mark is using something like this, and what he's ultimately trying to get us to see is that God is doing something in the nation of Israel for the Hebrew people. That's the 5 and 12. But on the other bookend, around that Syrophoenician encounter with the Gentile woman, the other bookend on that encounter is that God is also doing something among the other peoples of the world. That God's covenant is not just for the Hebrew people, the 12, the 5 and the 12, but also for the whole world, all peoples. That's the 4 and the 7. That God's care and love for humanity is an expanding window that isn't just about one people at one place in one time, but that Jesus is opening up their vision of who God cares about and is expanding it to the Gentile people. So when we do repetition with variance, that's why we want to pay attention to the things in this story that are different than the things in our previous story. All right, I'm going to pick it up in verse 14 here. The disciples had forgotten to bring bread, except for 1 loaf they had with them in the boat. Be careful, Jesus warned them. Watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees and that of Herod. They discussed this with one another and said, "Is this because we have no bread?" Aware of their discussion, Jesus asked them, "Why are you talking about having no bread? Do you still not see and understand? Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes but fail to see and ears but fail to hear? And don't you remember when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many basketfuls pieces did you pick up?" 12, they replied. "And when I broke the 7 loaves for the 4,000, how many basketful pieces did you pick up?" They answered, 7. And then he says to them, "Do you still not understand? I love when Jesus asks questions like this because I try and place myself as a disciple, trying to think what would have been my actual response. And if he had said to me, "Do you still not understand?" I gotta be honest, I probably would have said something like, "I'm gonna go with no. I'm thinking that I still don't get it." My dad was a very harsh man. He softened in later years, but when I was little, he was hard on me. I was the oldest son, and he had big expectations. And my least favorite thing that he did is he would ask me, because I was sort of a meathead. I was like what they call a dumb jock. My brain really didn't even start working till I was 18 at all. I was one of those kids. I was a late bloomer. And I would make bad decisions too, and very impulsive. And my dad would say to me, he would get really upset, and he would say, "What were you thinking?" Which it took me a long time to respond because I genuinely had no idea. Right? There's no way. Or I couldn't articulate what I was thinking because I'd get in even more trouble. Like, if what I did was bad, you should have seen what I was thinking about, you know? So before I could answer, he would correct me, like before I even got a chance to respond. He'd say, "What were you thinking?" And I just sort of looked dumbly at him. And then he would say, "You weren't, and that's the problem." So when I hear Jesus say to his disciples, like, what are you doing? Why are you talking about bread? Guys, bread's not the problem. We had all of that stuff with the 5, all that stuff with the 4. So you have one loaf. Like, what is your deal with bread? Right? He's flustered with them. So then he explains this thing and he answers, "Do you still not understand?" To which the answer is probably, no, we don't get it. We're still lost. But tucked into this thing, Jesus says this really odd warning. In verse 15, he says, "Watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees and that of Herod." What a strange thing to say. Because the Pharisees, that's a religious spirit, right? But Herod, that's a political thing. Herod was a political ruler. So wait a minute, what's the yeast? Because if it's a religious thing, I think I could get that. If it's a political thing, I could probably get that. What's the thing that I'm supposed to be careful of about that? And there are a couple theories about what Jesus is talking about. I think probably the strongest one has to do with power and influence. That he's warning them, like, it's really seductive. You got to be careful with that stuff. I think about yeast a lot, not because I'm a baker or anything, just because I love baked goods. This might surprise you by looking at me. I loved baked goods. I'm not gluten-free. I just sort of eat anything that people put in front of me. But my wife is gluten-free. And that started about 10 or 15 years ago. And so I had to start thinking about what was in the ingredients that were in baked goods in a new way. It was like opening up into a whole new world. And at the same time, I had a friend who got into home brewing beer. And I realized that both baking and brewing, I thought they were sort of art, right? Like interpreting the ingredients to bring about this delicious thing. It's not, it's science, right? It's math. Baking and brewing are math, they're not art. And you have to understand the ingredients. And here's the important thing. You have to get the sequence right. So not only do you need all of the right ingredients, they have to come in the right sequence. This is why I cannot bake and I cannot brew. I just don't have, that's not how my brain works. By the way, just out of curiosity, do any of you bake or brew? Bake? Okay. I notice people are way more willing to say they bake than they brew. Notice that. There's an art to this. And this thing with yeast, it's so interesting to me that if you either leave yeast out, A, or B, put too much in, so too little or too much, right, can have very different effects. But also, where it comes in, the impact that it makes on the finished product is so powerful. And because I know that Jesus said this thing about yeast, I like to pay attention when people are telling me stories about baking, or if I'm watching the Food Network or some baking show, and I'm always watching how these things come together. And I've noticed something interesting about yeast as Jesus is using it here, which is that power pulls on different ones of us differently. The seduction of power pulls at us in different ways. Use your powers. Do you use them for good, to benefit those around you, or to get what you need? That ingredient of power, if that's what Jesus is talking about with yeast, is a fascinating variable when you're hearing somebody's story, to ask them about places in their life they felt power, the most power, influence, places they've lost power, and how power affects them. Jesus says, be careful, because that stuff will get you, right? And yeah, he's using bread as sort of a word picture, a framing metaphor or whatever. But the thing he's most interested in is the effect that whatever this yeast is, that both the Pharisees and the Herodians that they have, that he's warning off of that. Say, be careful with that stuff. I'm very aware of this right now because, especially in election years like we have going on right now, you hear power and the desire for power talked about in really interesting ways. Sometimes with great virtue. Sometimes it's sort of hidden away in other agendas like education or taxes or religious freedom or something else. But it's interesting, and I want to invite you, as you watch political ads maybe this year, or as you have conversations with your friends, or if there are debates that come up between candidates, make special note of where power comes in or how it's pulling on the conversation. It's definitely worth tracking, because depending on where it comes, sometimes if it's right up front, right, this is about power, and it's obvious. Other times, it's sort of tucked in the middle, and then there are other times where it is definitely slipped in afterwards, right? It's just worth noting where the power comes in. What Jesus is inviting us into is a thing called the kingdom. It's a poem. It has no power except that we participate in it. And it's not mostly seeking the powerful and the influential and the impressive. It's looking for those who are willing. It's why Jesus involves his disciples in the feeding of the thousands, is that it's not all about this one person and their special powers, but involving the disciples and the people in that participation of power. The kingdom is a totally different way of being in the world. And in the coming weeks, Jesus is going to begin to show us a really stark contrast between the ways of this world and the ways of the kingdom of God.